Hello, everyone. Welcome to our first lecture in Psychology 4440. In this lecture, we're going to go over uh, sort of the broad scope of the course. We'll define some terms. We'll look at trends in current drug use in the U.S. We'll look at correlates and possible causes of drug use. And that will be this lecture. Next time, we'll talk about the history of drug use, and after that, we'll get into the biology of it. But for now, we're going to do an overview. If you have not yet watched the welcome video, I would recommend you do that first before proceeding on to this lecture. And with that, we will move on. So what we're going to do in this course in general is examine drug use from a variety of perspectives. So next time we'll really get heavily into the historical perspectives, and as the course goes on, as we talk about each drug, we'll talk about the history of that drug and the history of its use. And for the most part, that will be the last 100 years or so in the U.S. Next time we'll really get into ancient history of drugs. Um, and so that will be the second lecture of this week's module. This course also deals with the social effects of drugs and drug use. And this is a two-way street. So drug use affects society through the behaviors of individual drug users. And of course, society can affect the availability of drugs, the consequences of drug use, and so on. And so we'll look at the social impact of drug use. And we'll look at drug use from a scientific perspective. As I mentioned, in the next couple of weeks, we'll look at the biology of drug use, how drugs affect the brain, how the brain works without drugs. But that's not the only sense in which we'll be looking at this course content scientifically. Biology, of course, is not the only science. So we're going to look at drug use from a psychological perspective, but through a scientific lens. So looking at statistical trends in drug use, looking at behavior scientifically. So these different perspectives, different ways of looking at the phenomenon of drug use. In this session in particular, what we're going to do is first define our terms. So things like drugs, drug use, drug abuse, what do these things mean? What do these things, what differences are there in the meaning of these terms? And they do have meanings. Sometimes and oftentimes they develop negative connotations. And we're going to try and step away from negative connotations when they're not warranted for things like the term drug use, which really shouldn't have negative connotations. And so we'll define some of our terms so we know what we're talking about when we're discussing drugs and drug use. We'll look at recent trends in drug use. Again, this will be recent trends in the U.S. And we'll try to understand the causes of drug use. Now, we can't always get at that answer concretely. Sometimes we have to settle for looking at correlates, things that go along with drug use. And perhaps those are causes, perhaps they are not. So we always have to look at those data with some caution. But they are at least plausible explanations that seem to go along with drug use. And so we'll talk about those as well. So first things first, what is a drug? Well, in its essence, a drug is just a substance. So it's a chemical. It is a physical object. So something like cocaine. Cocaine is a specific chemical. It has a specific chemical structure that we now know. Of course, early on when cocaine was first discovered, we didn't have any idea what cocaine was, what the active ingredient was, and what it looked like structurally, but now we do. Alcohol has a chemical structure. And in this course, when we say alcohol, we mean drinking alcohol, which is called ethyl alcohol or ethanol. And alcohols are a class of chemical structures. There's lots of different alcohols technically. But when we say alcohol, what we mean is ethanol, ethyl alcohol, drinking alcohol. So I'll use alcohol as a shorthand for that particular type of alcohol. Drugs like amphetamine. So this is actually a class of substances, amphetamines, that can differ slightly in their chemical structure. Uh, Methamphetamine is a cousin of amphetamine. It has a similar chemical structure. It's a little bit different, uh, and they are in their essence chemicals. Something like nicotine, which is the primary psychoactive ingredient in tobacco. Uh, so this, again, is a chemical that affects how the brain works. So that's how it has its effects on behavior. And so when we talk about how the brain works, what we're talking about there is brain function. And a drug is something that alters the function or the structure of the brain. Now, as we'll see in the next couple of weeks, something that alters brain function is by necessity altering brain structure at some scale. Now, it may be changing the properties of individual neurons, which are tiny brain cells, and so those may not be visually apparent, how the structure of the brain is being changed. But if the brain is working differently, that's going to be instantiated, that's going to be based somehow on brain structure, either at a tiny scale or at a large scale. And we'll talk more about that in the next couple of weeks. Another part of the definition of a drug is that it's not a food. So if your blood sugar is low, sure, taking sugar, consuming sugar can have an effect on your behavior, but it's not that the drug is specifically affecting the brain. And so we make that distinction between a food, something that has nutritional content and affects behavior by increasing energy or by supplying other nutrients, and a drug, which has its effects directly on the brain and doesn't have nutritional value. Now, in the case of alcohol, we have sort of a special example because if you've ever seen a beer belly, you know that alcohol has nutritional content. It's not great nutritional content, but it is a source of calories. Here, we will classify alcohol as a drug, even though it has that nutritional content. Another term that gets used a lot is illicit drugs. And all that really means for a drug is that it's unlawful to possess or to use the drug. So it's illegal. And this course also will be focusing on psychoactive drugs. So certainly there are lots of drugs that affect the body, but don't have an effect on behavior or perception or sensation. So for pain relievers, those are psychoactive because pain is a signal that our brain interprets. And pain relievers, whether they're something as powerful as morphine or something as mild as aspirin, these all relieve pain. They all change our perception of the pain, of the state of our body. Whereas something that affects liver or kidney function, sure, we may be able to detect the change in our body, but they're not really affecting our brain directly or even affecting our perception of the stimuli around us or affecting our decision-making capabilities. So those aren't psychoactive drugs. We won't really be talking about those in this course. So, as mentioned previously, drugs are chemicals, and that carries with it certain consequences. First is that chemicals don't have moral value. So often it's often said that the drugs are bad or this drug is good. Um, as we'll see, that's sort of a simplistic way of describing drugs, and we're going to try and get away from describing drugs in this qualitative sense, good or bad. Um, they're just chemicals. It's just a collection of molecules or a single molecule. And so in that sense, they don't have moral value, but they do affect behavior. So in that sense, the effects that a drug has, the behavior that a drug produces, can have moral value. Someone can behave ethically or unethically as a consequence of drug use, but the drug itself is just an object. Um, and so it doesn't really have moral character. It's really about what happens as a consequence of using it. It's what we do as human beings that can be moral or immoral. So again, these good and bad labels are misleading. What further complicates the issue is that drugs have multiple effects. So drugs don't do just one thing. They seldom affect even just one body system. Uh, and even psychoactive drugs usually have multiple effects. Some of those consequences, some of those effects may be beneficial. They may relieve pain, and they may have negative effects. They may uh, create dependence on the drug. So a single drug can have multiple effects, and that those effects can be a mixture of beneficial and harmful consequences. And the drugs can also have different effects based on how much is being used. So labeling again a drug as good or bad is misleading because it depends on how we use it and what we do as a consequence of using it. There's also a big effect of the expectation of a drug's effectiveness or what the effects are going to be. So studies have shown that the more sociable a person expects to become as a function of drinking alcohol, the more sociable they actually do become. Um, there's also famous studies on the placebo effect, where you tell someone that this drug is going to relieve their pain, and then you give them a sugar pill, and they report less experienced pain. So these expectations about what a drug is going to do can clearly have a big effect on our perception and on our behavior. But again, the chemicals themselves will have the same effect, but our cognitive processes, our expectations, can affect our behavior at least as much as the drug does. Um, and again, few drugs have solely positive or negative effects. Even something that we know to be on the more dangerous end of the spectrum, like PCP, uh, originally developed as an anesthetic and does have that effect. Things like ketamine or similar. But drugs we're familiar with, alcohol. Alcohol is useful as a disinfectant. It has been used as a sedative, as even an anesthetic. And so these are useful properties of alcohol, but we're also familiar with some of the negative consequences, some of the behaviors that they can cause, that alcohol can cause. So again, it's simplistic to see a drug as entirely good or entirely bad because it has multiple effects, and those effects can be a mixture of good and bad. And of course, our society has viewed drugs differently as it has progressed, and also simultaneously, different segments of society view drugs differently. So in the 60s and 70s, certain drugs were thought to perhaps even expand consciousness and grant knowledge that you wouldn't otherwise have. And this was famously touted by Timothy Leary, who advocated the use of drugs and hallucinogens in particular. Of course, on the opposite end of the spectrum, you have social programs designed to discourage drug use in any form, and groups in society that claim that all drugs are bad, you should avoid drugs entirely. And this can be tied together with communities, with religious groups, with socioeconomic status. Uh, and again, both ends of the spectrum are a little simplistic for most drugs because drugs have both good and bad consequences to them. So labeling the chemical itself is not a particularly useful exercise. So there are some other common terms when we're dealing with drugs. One is drug use, which in our society often has negative connotations, especially when it's used to describe a person as a drug user. Uh, when we say drug user, what we're often referring to is someone who's abusing the substance. But a drug user is just that. It's someone who's using a drug. They could be using it in a prescribed fashion, as their doctor recommends. They could be using an over-the-counter drug. Someone who takes an Advil or an aspirin to get rid of a headache is using a drug. They are a drug user in that context. But it's very rare for society at large to view that person negatively, even though they are using a drug. So we're going to use drug use and drug user in a general sense, and certainly without that negative connotation, because it covers many behaviors, both appropriate use of a drug and inappropriate use of a drug. Another term is drug misuse. And this is most often applied when a person is using more of a prescribed drug than the doctor has recommended. So taking twice the recommended dosage of a painkiller while it's a prescribed drug is drug misuse because it's not being used in the recommended fashion. Also, drug misuse covers when when something is used for something other than its intended purpose. This is perhaps most commonly applied to inhalants, things like laughing gas, or more commonly now, things like spray paint, glue, other inhalants, where the substance is not intended to be used as a drug at all. It's intended for some other purpose, but it can be used as an inhalant, and so that would be misuse. And that's different from abuse because the term drug misuse is relative to the recommendation. Drug abuse is really describing a pattern of behavior. So this is a repeated drug-taking behavior. And most commonly, drug abuse builds in a concept of harmful consequences. So the person repeatedly takes the drug despite negative consequences in their social life, their family life, their health. And so that would be a proper use of the term drug abuse. There's also drug dependence, which is different from drug abuse. Again, we have this concept of frequent use. So we have a repeated pattern of behavior. And perhaps most importantly, drug dependence implies a difficulty controlling the use of the drug. So when someone seems unable to function without using the drug, then we often refer to them as being dependent on the drug. So they depend on the drug to function normally. So, and in order to do this, this implies a sort of frequent and repeated use, but builds in this additional concept of the person's life seeming to function, seeming to depend on using the drug. And there are two basic flavors of dependence. There's physical dependence, where there's an actual physiological reaction if the drug is discontinued, if the drug use is discontinued. And so this is often referred to as physiological dependence. And usually this is exemplified by withdrawal. So if someone exhibits withdrawal symptoms, if they've been repeatedly using the drug and they suddenly stop, that would be a case of physical dependence. And physical dependence can in fact lead to harmful consequences, even death, if the drug use is suddenly discontinued, which is why you often have to wean someone off a drug if they've become physically dependent. There's also psychological dependence, where someone's perceived psychological well-being seems to depend on using the drug. And that one's a little harder to define. It's a newer concept than physical dependence. It's less obvious. It's more subjective. But it is often classified as a form of dependence. Finally, we get to the concept of drug addiction, which, again, is separate from drug dependence. The definitions here differ. So even within the realm of psychology, what defines an addiction can be very difficult to pin down. There's disagreement about what qualifies as an addiction and what doesn't. But the most common element to the definition of addiction is a compulsive use behavior. So this is not just someone frequently uses the drug or even someone has difficulty feeling normal without the drug. This is where their life starts to revolve around acquiring and using the drug. So we refer to that as a compulsive use. They feel compelled to acquire and use the drug. And of course, there are non-physical substances that are sometimes referred to as being addictive. So we hear about sex addiction, we hear about gambling addiction, even exercise addiction. And this is where the controversy comes in. Some people think these are as legitimate a use of the term addiction as for things like alcohol, cocaine. And some people disagree. Some people say that these are not true addictions. And the controversy continues. There's no obvious winner in that debate. And we won't really talk about non-drug addictive behaviors in this course. Okay, so that's some of our terminology. Now we'll move on and talk about some trends in drug use. So again, this is over recent history. This is our current society and in the U.S. And so we can look at a table like Table 1.1 here in your textbook. And what Table 1.1 does is list some commonly used drugs and looks at some usage statistics, whether the person has ever used the drug, whether they've used the drug at all in the past 30 days, and whether the drug has been used daily in the past 30 days. And as you might expect, the numbers decrease in that order. So ever used is the most common, and then fewer people have used any given drug in the last 30 days, and even fewer have used it daily. In fact, if you look at this table, you see that a handful of individuals that have taken the survey have used alcohol or cigarettes or marijuana daily, whereas none have used inhalants, amphetamines, hallucinogens, cocaine daily. And so this gives us a broad overview of what fraction of the population is using a given drug and how often they're using it. But these things are difficult to estimate, and there's a number of reasons for that. One is that the data can be inaccurate, not wildly so, but we have to worry about the accuracy of data and that when we collect surveys like this for a couple of reasons. First is that people are often reluctant to report their drug use patterns. That's private information. It's often viewed as sensitive personal information. And so people will often withhold that information, especially when it comes to illegal drugs. They're worried about getting in trouble even when the survey is anonymous. Or they feel shame or other social pressure not to reveal drug use. The other source of inaccuracy is just people's memories are not perfect. So somebody might have said, oh yeah, I used alcohol sometime in the last 30 days when actually it was 2 months ago and they just misremembered. Or they underestimate their use, even though they're honestly trying to answer the survey. So there's some inaccuracy there. Another source of inaccuracy is what's called selection bias. And that is to say, here we're looking at a group of post-high school individuals. These are college students. And that's a very select population. Not everyone goes to college. Not everyone is in that age group, so we're sort of ignoring other age groups. And obviously this is in the US, so we're ignoring other nationalities. So we have the selection bias. We have a very particular population that we're looking at, and the question is whether those statistics really hold for other groups. There's also a lack of detail in these surveys. I do psychological research myself, so I know that if you give someone a survey that's too long, they often won't fill it out. So it's hard to get very detailed data from a large number of people. But a little data is better than none. And so these basic questions of have you ever used the substance? Have you used the substance in the last 30 days? And have you used it daily? These are fairly simple questions. They're quick questions, but they're not as detailed as we might like. So the survey can't differentiate between someone who used the substance once, who had a drink 3 weeks ago, and someone who's been drinking heavily 5 nights out of 7 for the last month, even though those are very different patterns of usage. So let's look at a particular drug, in this case, marijuana. And we can look in this figure from your book and look at trends in marijuana use across 2 different age groups over the last 40 years. So again, these are estimates of drug use, and these data highlight, again, the importance of our data collection methods. So previously, we looked at a survey of students enrolled in school. Other data can be collected using house-to-house surveys. Now, the benefit of a house-to-house survey is you're not just looking at students anymore, you're getting a broader sample of the population. The downside is that house-to-house surveys, people are less likely to participate. So it's no longer a piece of paper that you can drop in a box anonymously. This is now someone who's at your house. So you're being asked questions from an actual person. And so the accuracy and the willingness to participate are often less in house-to-house surveys. What we see in this particular graph for marijuana use is a consistency across age groups. So here we have ages 18 to 25 and ages 12 to 17. And on the y-axis, we have the percentage using marijuana in the last month. And using in the last month is often a shorthand, an index for what we call a current user. Of course, someone could have used it for the first and only time in the last month, but that's not viewed as particularly likely. So here we're looking at sort of a convenient definition of a current user. And so looking over the last 40 years, we can see, first of all, that usage rates in ages 18 to 25 are higher than those aged 12 to 17. That's not surprising. But one thing we also see is that there's a consistency across the two age groups. So for both, we see a peak in marijuana use in the late 70s. And then that decreases fairly sharply across the 80s, into the early 90s, where it reaches a minimum. And then use starts to rise again. So right now we're at a higher frequency of usage for both age groups as compared to around 1990, but not as high as in the late 70s. And so these are scientifically collected data. This is a set of data about behavior, about drug-taking behavior. And so if you hear the claim that people are using marijuana now more than ever, well, this graph demonstrates that's not true. In fact, they're only using it about half as much as in the late 70s. Or that people have started using marijuana at an earlier age. Well, no, that's not true either. We don't see a sharp increase recently in the use by young users. The fraction of young users as compared to older users has remained pretty constant throughout. So again, we can use these scientific data to dispel rumors or reports in society that drug use is on the rise or is higher now than it has been before. So again, still looking at marijuana, the question is, we see these changes in use. What accounts for those changes? We're trying to explain these patterns as a way of understanding what causes people to use marijuana, um, and, uh, and understanding that can help us perhaps create prevention programs or treatment programs, whatever is viewed as being needed by the society. And again, opinions as to how necessary preventing use is a matter of debate. But right now, we're just looking at the data and saying, okay, what accounts for use? Not that we're trying to decrease or increase use of this particular drug. So the most obvious and perhaps first thing we go to is availability. Perhaps over the years, people have been just as willing to try or repeatedly use marijuana, and the only difference is that it was more available in the late 70s and very unavailable in the early 90s, and that people were just as readily using it if they could find it, but they had an easier, harder time finding it over the course of the last 40 years. Now, if you look at the availability of marijuana, and this is people's assessment of availability, this is not the actual um, availability of the drug. This is how people perceive it as being available. So again, we have a possible source of inaccuracy there. But the availability really hasn't changed. So that's not a very good explanation for why usage behavior has changed. However, people's perceived estimate of the risk of using marijuana has changed. And as you see, it matches fairly well the usage pattern. So when the risk is perceived as being low, as it was in the late 70s, usage goes up. When the risk is perceived as being high, as it was in the early 90s, usage goes down. So that's actually a pretty good explanation. Again, we don't know for sure because this is what's called correlational data. And this is just saying that these two variables seem to go together hand in hand. It's not that one necessarily causes the other. You could make the argument, well, people perceive marijuana as being very risky, so they decrease their use. But you could, perhaps less plausibly, but still plausibly, make the opposite argument, that if someone doesn't see very many people using marijuana, they, from that data, assume that it must be risky. So it's hard to say with these correlational data what's causing what. And in fact, there could be some third factor that's causing both. And so you can't make a very clean causal argument from these sort of correlational data. So we can look at other substances and compare more popular substances to less popular substances and see if the trends are similar. And in fact, here we see a graph of alcohol, marijuana, and cocaine use across the last 35 years. And we see that these all exhibit a similar pattern. They peaked around the late 70s, early 80s. They reached a minimum in the early 90s. And now they've leveled out to somewhere between those two extremes in our current society. So what these point to is that it's not the availability of any one substance. Alcohol has been fairly common and easily obtained throughout the whole time, but we see a similar pattern across all three substances, which suggests that it may be that it's more likely to be a social change, a progression or change in social attitudes towards drug use. And that can explain all three trends better than the availability or assessment of riskiness in any one drug. So again, we see trends that are fairly obvious that we would probably expect. Alcohol is the most commonly used substance, with marijuana after that and cocaine the least common of the three. This also, again, that brings into question what our society's role is in drug use. So what is the importance of drug policies, especially government enforced or government-run drug prevention policies? So it was popular when we were seeing drug use decrease throughout the 80s to give credit to the Reagan administration. Reagan was a more conservative president, and one of his famous contributions, along with the First Lady, Nancy Reagan, was the Just Say No campaign, which was geared toward drug prevention. And so a lot of people made that connection between the Just Say No campaign and the decrease in drug use. Similarly, when the Clinton administration began in the early 90s and drug use began to rise again, people said the Clinton administration was the cause. And then there are a number of reasons this doesn't really hold up. First, administrations take a while to implement policies. So drug use was already on the way down when the Just Say No campaign was beginning. And drug use was already on the way up before any of Clinton's policies could have been implemented. Also, Clinton's policies were actually not more permissive of drug use. And so again, we have a number of data points that suggest that it's not actually the government policies that may be the primary force behind changes in drug use behavior. So beyond assessment of availability and risk, we have other correlates of drug use. And these are things such as risk factors, which are environmental or behavioral factors that increase the likelihood someone is a drug user, and protective factors, which are the opposite. The more of these factors someone exhibits, the less likely they are to use drugs. And some of these are not surprising. So having people around you who use marijuana, for example, makes one more likely to use it. And having extracurricular activities and being heavily participatory in school or religious activities, these are protective factors. You're less likely to be a marijuana user if these are true of your life. But again, these are correlates. We don't know for sure that these are causes of marijuana use. We just know they seem to go along with it. So for example, famous correlation is that between low grades and drug use. Now, is it that low grades are causing the drug use. The person's using drugs as an escape from poor academic performance, or is it the other way around? Is it that drug use causes poor performance in school? I know we can get at this question other ways, but these risk and predictive factors by themselves are just correlates. So other things that correlate on drug use are things like demographic factors. So these are things like gender, which here I'm using synonymously with sex. I'm not making that distinction in this course, even though psychologically those are different ideas. Um, so gender or sex, it's well established that males use drugs more frequently than females. Race, and here we have some violation of expectations that our society in the U.S. has built up. And these expectations are decades old and often stem from inaccurate reporting or other social attitudes about ethnic groups. So what we see here is that whites, Caucasians, are actually more frequent users of alcohol and tobacco than other ethnic groups, when that may violate what we expect. Uh, Similarly, we have differences in education. So being a high school graduate but not being in college, one is more likely to smoke than someone who has been in college. But if you're a college graduate, you're actually more likely to use alcohol than a non-graduate. So these are all characteristics, these are all descriptions of individuals that again seem to correlate with drug use. There are other factors as well. So personality, uh, and the most famous personality trait that correlates with drug use is called impulsivity. And impulsivity is just what it sounds like. It's an index of the likelihood that someone acts on their immediate desires without consequence for long-term behavior. And this is a personality trait that correlates with lots of other behaviors, but seems to be very predictive of drug use. And of course, there are genetic factors as well. And genetic factors seem to predict whether or not someone that is already using drugs will become dependent on them, rather than whether they'll try them or not. Whether an individual will try a drug seems to depend more on the environment in which they live uh, than than genetic factors. But once they've started trying a drug, whether they will become dependent seems to be more reliant on genetic factors. Drug use has what are called antecedents. And what is an antecedent? Antecedents are events or traits that occur before drug use starts. So again, one of the hard things about these correlates we've been talking about is that it's hard to pin down the cause. Which one came first, the low grades or the drug use? Hard to say. But if we can look at academic performance before drug use started, well now those are more likely to be causes. It's not 100% ironclad. We still have to be careful about assigning a causal attribution to a particular behavior, like low grades. If you get low grades in the first grade and then end up using drugs in the 8th grade, well, using drugs in the 8th grade can't cause the low grades in first grade. That's not the way time works. But it is possible that both behaviors result from some other environmental factor. So it could come from a community that encourages drug use, or at least condones it, and doesn't emphasize academic performance. So those two behaviors in school could stem from the community, and it may not be the low grades that are causing it, but it's a possibility. So some common antecedents to drug use are aggressive behavior, although actually both ends of the spectrum, being both aggressive or shy, seem to predict drug use. There's also membership in what's referred to as a deviant subculture. Deviant subculture isn't a term I like that much because it, again, has this negative connotation. What we mean by deviant just means unusual statistically. so not part of mainstream society. Deviant has a negative connotation that I usually like to steer away from. And so the idea is that if a subculture, if a group of people uh, deviates from social norms, it's more likely they'll deviate from other norms like laws and attitudes regarding drug use. There's also what are known as gateway substances. If you've ever heard of the idea that marijuana is a gateway drug, this is the idea that using a more condoned drug, a less illicit drug, for example, um, is a stepping stone to using a more illicit drug, perhaps a drug with more harmful consequences, either legally or in terms of health. And so there's some truth to this. Again, this is a correlate. Yes, it's true that using alcohol in high school makes one more likely, or I shouldn't say makes, is associated with being a drug user later, but it doesn't seem to be the case that alcohol causes later drug use. Again, the use of alcohol, tobacco, marijuana, these seem to be behaviors that are associated, that are signals that a person is more likely to use drugs later on. These are not things that lead directly to later drug use, it seems. First of all, the order doesn't really matter. So it's not that alcohol always precedes marijuana, or that tobacco always precedes marijuana. Any of these things are behavioral signals that suggest the person may be more open to drug use later in life. And there's some other influences that are important. So certainly we'll start talking about the brain in the next couple of weeks. And the fact is that our decision making isn't always in our long-term best interests. And there's a lot of literature about this. It's really quite interesting. That our brains, we do seem to have two systems. There's a decision-making system that prefers short-term gains, short-term pleasure, and there's another system that considers long-term consequences and makes decisions based on the overall outcome of a decision. And these two things can often be in conflict, and it's not the case that one always wins over the other. And so we may take a pleasurable drug that is bad for our health in the long term. There are also developmental effects. So being a teenager, being an adolescent, uh, adolescents are more at risk for using drugs. They're more likely to use drugs for a number of reasons. First, again, is that their brains are still developing. And so they have these two systems in competition, but the long-term system isn't fully developed yet. So they tend to make shorter-term decisions. Uh, the other is that as an adolescent, that is a developmental stage where the person is developing, is defining their identity. And they're also trying to gain the approval of other individuals. Their self-esteem is still in development. And so that's a sensitive stage, and it's a stage in which people are more likely to use drugs. Finally, drugs themselves are reinforcing. And what does that mean? It means that using a drug affects the brain such that it's more likely to use that drug in the future. The drug increases its own probability of being used. Of course, there are additional social factors that are important. Family, community, friends. Uh, and the evidence suggests that the social factors, again, really impact whether a person is likely to try the drug. So how probable is it they'll use the drug the first time? And as the drug use is repeated, it really becomes more about the personal experience. So how pleasurable did the person find the drug? How prone to addiction, perhaps genetically, is the individual? And so at first, uh, whether to try the drug or not seems to depend on social factors. And after that, it becomes more about individual factors. Okay, so that wraps up our first lecture, general trends in drug use, defining some of our terms, and this will serve us throughout the rest of the course. Next time, we'll talk about the history of drug use. And this will begin in ancient history and get up through around the turn of the 20th century. And drugs have been an important influence on the field of medicine throughout history, also in the development of religious practices. They've had an impact on economies, not just now, but in the recent and ancient past. And finally, they even changed the course of history in terms of politics, in terms of how nations relate to one another. And so we'll go over all of that in Lecture 2 later on this week. And I will see you then.